The ones around him now, particularly the 32nd Brigade, led by his son Kamis, is probably the best equipped in the army. It's received Western equipment, contracts inked in recent years. It's received outside training. And so despite the obsolescence of some weaponry, despite the poor servicing of some of his planes, he still retains the very best equipment as against the rebels.
So, the Libyan army may not have the strength that it claims, but there's still a significant force on the ground. Analysts say that Gaddafi has a loyalist brigade made up of 10 to 12,000 troops, and those forces are trying to block the advance of the opposition and maintain control in western Libya. The heavy presence of loyalist forces means that Gaddafi still retains a strong grip on the capital, Tripoli, the town of Sabha, and his hometown of Sirte. It's thought that Libya destroyed its entire stockpile of chemical weapons in 2004 as part of a rapprochement with the West. It does have deadly mustard gas stored at a secret desert location, but no longer has the capability to deliver it. Small comfort for the rebels as they battle for victory. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's now speak to Dave Hartwell. He's a Middle East and North Africa analyst at IHS, Jane's Defense. He joins us live from London. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Let's talk about Gaddafi's military capability first. Do you think he has what it takes to recapture these areas in the east that are no longer under his control?
Well, it certainly appears that he has the forces to be able to stop the rot, if you like, and stop the advance of the opposition forces. I think there are question marks about whether he's able to actually go on to the offensive. I think he certainly has enough to defend Tripoli at the moment and the other sites that you mentioned a few minutes ago. But whether he's able to muster enough forces to be able to launch retake cities and towns in the east, I think is open to question at the moment.
Let's talk about the no-fly zone, because this is an idea that's been floating around now for a number of days. What exactly is a no-fly zone? Just explain to us first, and what will it achieve?
Well, a no-fly zone is essentially a mechanism that is imposed, if you like, from outside normally by Western nations. As if we look at the example in Iraq, the Kurdish no-fly zone in the north just after the 1991 Gulf War, that forces opposition aircraft to stay on the ground. It means that they can't launch operations against ground formations. They can't launch operations against protesters. So that essentially is a no-fly zone. But whether, I mean, we've heard various reservations expressed by the Americans, and Bob Gates was the most fervent in that it is not a small operation. He's right that you need to take out the air defences. You need to make the skies essentially safe for the opposition air forces to operate unimpeded. So
a no-fly zone, in essence, then, is a military operation in itself, and it doesn't mean that the fighting is going to end right away.
No, it doesn't, and it may be seen as aiding the fighting in the sense that it will restrict Gaddafi's ability to launch airstrikes, but it won't. My guess is it won't put an end to the fighting, and indeed any attempt to sort of come in on the side of the opposition will be construed by Gaddafi, certainly and his supporters as the West, if you like, aiding the regime change. It won't be like the situation in northern Iraq, for example, where there was essentially a humanitarian operation, no-fly zone. This will be seen as something very, very different.
But it would help the cause of the anti-government protesters, wouldn't it? Because it seems now that they are also calling for the international community to impose this no-fly zone over Libya, because they've been suffering attacks, air attacks, in fact, in the east from the Gaddafi forces.
It would indeed, but that would still be dependent whether the opposition forces would be able to exploit that. Still remains a key question, because the control of Tripoli is increasingly seen as the key to controlling the country. So, whether the opposition forces will be able to exploit a no-fly zone and exert their control over Tripoli would remain the key issue. So it might make their job a little bit easier, but it wouldn't by itself be seen as decisive.
Okay, but if again, just for our viewers who may not be familiar with this idea of a no-fly zone, if it was to be imposed, who would have to take the lead on it? Would it be NATO? Would the decision have to to come from the United Nations? What exactly happens before a no-fly zone is imposed?
I mean, in theory, the US and NATO...
Oh, we seem to have lost our guest there, Dave Hartwell, who was just joining us there live from London and talking to us about this no-fly zone idea that's being floating around, possibly to help the anti-government forces in Egypt. Let's go now to Egypt, in fact. We were talking about Libya, of course. Let's go to Egypt now, where the Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq, has resigned. He has now been replaced by the former Transport Minister, Essam Sharaf. Let's speak to AlJazeera's Ayman Mohildin, who joins us live from Cairo. Now, the resignation of Ahmed Shafiq was, of course, Ayman, one of the key demands of the anti-government protesters who were, in fact, planning a march in Cairo again this Friday. Is this going to ease the tensions? Are they going to be satisfied with this new nomination now?
Well, certainly we are getting more information as to exactly what may have unfolded in terms of the nominating process. But to answer your question very straightforward, yes, we've been in touch with some of the organizers that have been involved in these weekly protests on Friday. And the insight that we've been given so far is that they're expecting the numbers to be a lot less now this Friday. They are calling on the protesters that at the end of Friday to go home. But certainly they know that this Friday, the tone of the protest will slightly be different, because as we were expecting this particular Friday, the calls were really pinpointed at the former Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq. They were increasingly against his tenure as Prime Minister. Now that he has stepped down, we are expecting the protests on Friday still to take place, but certainly not perhaps to the same capacity that we were expecting before this announcement. At the same time, we are told that Dr. Essam Sharaf was indeed a name that was put forth by a coalition of the groups representing the revolutionary movement. So indeed, it was somebody that the revolutionary movements or the groups that make up this coalition had supported in their talks with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces.
Because apparently, from what I've been reading, he was also one of the people who actually took to Tahrir Square and joined the anti-government protests there that were calling for Hosni Mubarak to stand down.
Indeed, you know, when we learn more about this individual, we see that certainly he was a person who, although he served under former President Hosni Mubarak, it was for a brief 2 years. He was very critical of the regime when he stepped down in 2006. He criticized the government for not having the vision or committing the resources to modernizing Egypt's transportation infrastructure. And in fact, he was one of the officials that was very pro-revolution early on. And as you mentioned, in the final days before President Hosni Mubarak stepped down, he was actually seen in Tahrir Square, giving his moral support and being part of the crowds there. So certainly he is considered to be a very independent technocrat. He is not a regime loyalist, and more importantly, he is not a former ruling National Democratic Party official or loyalist. So indeed, he is bringing with him a great deal of credibility, particularly on the street level.
Certainly, the Supreme Military Council in Egypt, Ayman, has been making a number of gestures now to appease these protesters, nominating